For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. Everybody's career begins somewhere, but I was still a little surprised to learn that my guest Mark Templeton, the former CEO of the multi-billion-dollar software innovator Citrix Systems, got his start in sheet metal. I'll let you listen to our conversation to learn the story of his career pivot, but sufficient to say, it turned out to be a pretty epic shift. Mark joined Citrix first as marketing VP, then president, and then for more than 15 years, president and CEO, departing after a full 20-year career at the company. He led Citrix as it transformed from around a $15 million business with a single product to a multinational software leader in multiple categories worth more than $3 billion and with more than 100 million users around the world. Today, he serves on several boards. He offers very thoughtful mentorship and consulting to up-and-coming business leaders. You might wonder who that would include. On some level, you have Mark to thank for your ability to work from home. Mark was a visionary when it came to virtualization, including mobility management, networking, collaboration, security, and Citrix did a great deal to popularize and refine many of the technologies we take for granted today as we like to work from wherever we might be. He's also proud, as you'll hear him discuss, of the design thinking culture he engineered at Citrix and some of the company's value-driven cultural aspects. I could have certainly talked to Mark for a lot longer, but we kept our conversation somewhat focused on a few areas that have particular resonance in thinking about the customer experience: metrics, acquisitions, and company culture. Some points you might want to listen for. How Mark amusingly calls CX washing has diluted the overall impact of CX in the business world. Second, the benefits and limitations of cultural change, based on his efforts to embed design thinking and customer centricity in the Citrix culture. And we do have a discussion of complementing good intent with measurement. Also, the human and business challenges of serving customers effectively through acquisitions. Well, Mark oversaw about 50 acquisitions at Citrix, so he has quite a perspective. How it might not be a coincidence that only the software industry and the drug industry call their customers users. Enjoy that conversation. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Mark. I'd like to start by actually going right back to the start of your professional career, largely because what I read here is that you started your career, correct me if I'm wrong, draftsman in a sheet metal company. And so yes. Just how did you go from that into ultimately becoming a software leader?
Well, that's a whole podcast all by itself. But suffice it to say that being a draftsman was, an incredible experience building on my product design background, which then led me to realize that I needed a business degree to sort of get into the world of business in a serious way. And a couple jumps later, I actually co-founded a hardwood molding company with a partner.
Didn't we all back then?
It was very, very common in those days. But the interesting thing is, in that kind of business, it's like being a butcher, okay? And being a butcher, as the saying goes, to make money, you have to sell every part of the pig, including the oink. So in a business that uses lumber and to make moldings, you had to sell every bit of the lumber, the sawdust, the off-fall, kind of every piece. And that required technology to actually figure that out. So I told my partner we needed software. He said, do you know how to do that? And I said, no, but how hard could it be? So I wrote the software that optimized the yield of the factory. And once I wrote the software, I told him, Vaughn, I just have to tell you, my love for hardwood is now lesser than my love for software. And that's how I got into the software business.
Well, over the last couple of years in COVID, you could probably make more money out of hardwood than you probably could have made out of software. It's been a good business. That's a great story. You're obviously best known for your time at Citrix, and when we were talking earlier, one of the things you'd drawn a distinction, which I thought was very interesting, between what I think I get this right. You said a highly engineered NPS score, which existed in several parts of Citrix. And obviously the alternative is one that's not highly engineered. And I think this is particularly interesting for our audience. So perhaps you could tell a bit about the use of NPS at Citrix, but also this distinction between highly engineered and not.
Yes. Well, sadly, the highly engineered NPS is actually pretty darn actionable, and it's pretty darn good. The sad part of it is, I don't know what the number truly is, but I would guess that 90% of all people that report NPS are doing it as a checkbox. They're doing it with, like surveys that are periodic. They're just, as I said, I call it CX washing, it doesn't really do them any good, but a board likes to see an NPS number, and so they do whatever it takes with the least effort. But our SaaS business, specifically the go-to-meeting business, we use the full NPS science, and we used it so well that we could actually determine what actions we needed to take, either from a customer service perspective or the software design, the software experience, any number of things where we were getting verbatims, and we could literally predict that fixing that particular thing would have this effect on our NPS score. And so we engineered improvements in NPS by practicing it as a science. But as I said, very few people actually do that.
I love the term CX washing. So do you think, I've always thought that part of the problem was management teams and certainly boards like the idea, but don't understand enough about it to actually realize it's happening. I mean, you could argue some of it, and the washing metaphor suggests that it's almost a deliberate effort, but it could just be a result of lack of understanding, right?
Yeah, no, I think it is a lack of understanding. I think, there's the measures that are common, or NPS. That's sort of the more tech, I'd say, driven measure. But, most companies try to have some measure of, how there's the quality of service to customers. And so CSAT and all the ways that have been invented to come up with a CSAT score. And I'm sure a lot of companies, industrial companies, consumer products, et cetera, have various ways. Because everyone in every stakeholder wants to understand, are our customers satisfied? And even better, are we improving? And where are they not satisfied? And the problem with a lot of the tools that are used, they're just not actionable enough.
Yeah, so I mean, we're talking about a couple of different problems potentially here, right? So assuming the intent is good,
yes.
At the end of the day, it's a problem with data, which obviously I wholeheartedly agree with. I think traditionally, I don't think we've understood just how weak the data sets are. And obviously, we're trying to be in the business of solving that problem now because we think it's instrumental to this. From the perspective of a leader running a company, though, what I thought was interesting was you'd gotten some good results out of this, but you also had some sections of the business that you weren't that happy with. Is there a different approach leadership ought to be taking to get these kind of results?
It's let's just say that once a culture forms around a way of doing things, and even with all the best of intent of serving customers, and I'm very proud of what we did at Citrix in terms of exporting our culture, which was all about being authentic, having each other's back, and really honorable intentions. But despite all of that, you really have to have tools that everyone agrees to adopt, because it's easy to get people to adopt the whole notion of, all right, we need to pay attention to the full customer journey, and it's easy to even map it out. I think most companies that get that far in the conversation, they find ways to map it and even improve the mapping. But I think where they fall short is in changing procedural sort of aspects of the business, changing the design of their products, changing the culture or the mindset of those delivering the services, kind of the full range of things. I think those things are very, very difficult. So, one of the things we did at Citrix that, again, proud of, but took many years, we started a training curriculum in what we call design thinking, which, design thinking actually is all about reframing a problem and how you describe a problem, and working from the customer, whoever that customer would happen to be, backwards to remove friction and increase delight and listen to what they say, etc. And it did have a broad impact. That was positive, but with our so-called enterprise software products, we never got the telemetry into the product to complement all the good intent that was being applied. And why it's pretty hard to do after the fact.
Yeah, I'm chuckling a little. I'm not trying to draw an equivalence at all. I mean, I obviously the company I was a CEO of, order of magnitude smaller than Citrix, but even in a small business that had 300 or 400 employees, you quickly get an appreciation of the idea that the CEO isn't this all-powerful entity that can sort of direct the organization, and the organization, you say everyone go left, and they're all going to go left.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine a company that size. I mean, that's not to let anyone off the hook, and I think you understand. I'm not here to say, oh yes, that we all don't carry some responsibility for shaping our companies.
Right.
But I think this idea that it's easy to move an organization when the direction's been established, when the culture's been established, I think it's a colossal lift. And you illustrate that perfectly by talking about an awareness of the challenge in getting this organization to think differently, an enormous amount of effort to move it in the right direction, some really impressive results in some parts of the business that clearly went that way, and
yes,
some challenges in others. And I wonder, would you agree with this? I mean, one of the things that companies have learned as they've shifted from on-premise to SaaS is the SaaS culture in some ways seems to me to be much more conducive to an environment of customer-centered operations, data-driven customer retention. Just mentally, it seems like it's a totally different model for a business.
100%. 100%. So the way to think about that, I think, is pretty simple. Let's keep it within the software realm. How many, legacy software companies designed to run on-prem actually use their own product on a day-to-day basis, including the operational end of the spectrum in terms of, running the data center infrastructure? I'd say, it's an exception. I mean, obviously, test environments, et cetera, but that doesn't count, right? In a SaaS model, you're building the wheel one time, and then you're showing people how to install it on, a locomotive, a semi, uh, uh, a tractor trailer, an automobile, a wheelbarrow, etc. So it's designed once, it's managed by the builder, um, serviced and maintained by the builder, and therefore the it's just naturally in the interest of the builder, uh, for that wheel to operate smoothly and flawlessly, always be up to date, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of built in, and then most SaaS companies build in service level agreements with penalties and so forth.
Right.
So the economics, everyone's aligned in a SaaS kind of model.
I also think that SaaS has evolved. When I started in the SaaS business, I think there was a real focus on acquisition, but not much understanding of the sort of economics of retention. And you fast forward a decade, and I think you talk to any SaaS investor, any significant private equity or venture investor, and they'd say net revenue retention is the biggest predictive indicator of profitability in the future. Now, that statement sounds very ordinary today, but a decade ago, I don't think anyone made that statement. I think, in fact, that was very badly understood. And actually, even retention rates, you had companies showing 80, 85-point retention rates, and people said, that's kind of fine. You're losing 15% of your customers versus 120, 130 points of net retention today, which you see in a lot of successful businesses.
Yeah.
And so I think the culture of focus on retention in SaaS businesses has caught up with the economics.
Yeah.
I think on-prem businesses, to some extent, have benefited from the fact that, look, on-prem was much more high switching cost businesses. And if you're in a high switching cost business, you get lazy, right? Because your customers are hostaged in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of the single biggest problem for on-prem is it requires a DIY model. So, you can take 10 teams, give them the money to go to a Home Depot to buy materials to build a shed, and you'll get 10 flavors of sheds and 10 levels of quality of sheds. And, and that leads to highly varying degrees of customer satisfaction, versus, buying one that's pre-built, et cetera, and you just get to consume it yourself instead of do it yourself.
Right. Let's change gear a little bit, because I want to talk about acquisitions, because you obviously did a colossal number of acquisitions. I don't keep count. You probably do, and you probably remember, certainly all the big ones. When acquisition strategies have a pretty poor reputation for success in general, right? I mean, the stats always point to a lot of failure, and from a customer perspective, they can seem both jarring and negative, because if your vendor is acquired, very few customers say, "Oh, great, my beloved vendor is now part of a bigger company. That means things are just going to get better from here on." What's your perspective? Is there a particular approach to acquisition that you think creates that success? And I'm particularly interested in the customer perspective, obviously.
Yes. So this one is the way I think about this one is that, and it's overly simplistic, but it works actually to start a good conversation and understanding. Two types of acquisitions. Type one is adjacency. And adjacency means it plugs in or sits beside what I already do. And the expectations that customers would and should have is that over time, these things will meld, even though the packaging may not say that. But they, from an experience in terms of the people behind the design, kind of all of the factors, should feel very much like one. The second kind of acquisition is where, you enter a new business segment where you might have a similar buyer. It's a, but it's not and it could be adjacent, but it it could be adjacent, but mostly in an integration kind of way where the products talk to each other. I think there the expectations are different. Um, so I think the adjacent type of acquisition um, is very hard to pull off because you really do have to align kind of design ethos, where in the priority stack is CX, what methodologies do you have on each side of the table, and invariably everyone comes together excited about doing the deal, but they all think that they do it better than the other guy. And
Right.
so it really takes a lot of effort and frankly a lot of dictating, to force that melding together, and it does take time. I think that when you do the other type of something that's a new business, there I think you have a lot more flexibility, and you have flexibility to learn. So, I remember we acquired a small VPN company. It was called Net6, and they had this appliance, and we were a software company, but everyone said, "What you mean? We're going to start selling an appliance that you install in the data center?" Um, and and I said, "Yes, we're going to do it because there are huge strategic reasons to do it." But that team that we acquired, they understood because they had been through acquisitions before. They came forward and said, from the day we close the deal to the day we launch the product will be 30 days. And in 30 days, it's going to look like the existing Citrix team designed it, priced it, positioned it, and enabled the sales team in the field to sell it. And that was so successful, and we learned so much of that success by listening to the acquired team and learning from them. And we tried to apply that as much as we could to other acquisitions. We did about 50 during my time as CEO.
Yeah, that's an amazing number, and I think the question, because a lot of companies grow through acquisition, right? It's not that unusual, and
Right.
certainly a big part of private equity strategy is do an initial investment and then build off it with acquisition as a mechanism to achieve growth. It always seems like the customer takes a bit of a back seat in these conversations, right? There's a laser-like focus on the financial engineering.
Right.
And there's almost an absence of concern for the perception of the customer. There's at an abstract level, people will say, well, we clearly understand that we're buying revenue to a degree. I mean, not every time, but there's a desire to retain revenue, retain customers.
Right.
But there doesn't seem to me to be a lot of focus on the practicalities of what that means. And I've been on the sell side for 2 companies, on the buy side for a couple as well. And I don't think on any instance I would have said, yeah, we really understood what this meant for customers and that opportunity. Is this just something that management's missing in the whole equation of acquisition?
Well, the example you gave, and again, no offense to PE companies, they've clearly been very successful, but you have the type of deal that is really about milking the most profitable customers, um, and which is not about growth. All right. And then you have the other type of PE firm, and very traditional for like a public company, to do acquisitions to drive growth. And if you're trying to drive growth, then you necessarily have to put the customer first in terms of their experience, how you're packaging, how you're designing products to work together, et cetera. And, there's no magic bullet, because if you put 2 things that were built by 2 different teams, unless they did something magical by, wrapping everything with APIs, and where you get to then, put a skin around, an API suite. It's just not, it doesn't work that way. And so, you know, those kinds of acquisitions, there is attention paid to the customer, and CX is a much higher priority. And while also, of course, getting the financial model to work.
And it's also, it seems to me like there's an opportunity for much better due diligence around this, right? So, one of the obvious, you do immense amounts of due diligence around financials, but
yes,
relatively small amounts of due diligence around customers. And if I was acquiring a company again and they said, well, we don't have any credible metrics that measure the health of our customer base, and, not just advocating for NPS, but anything that explains to me the health of this customer base in a very objective analysis, at the very least, I want to run some kind of process to understand that, right? And I know some of the big consulting firms, the Bains and the McKinseys, have done this in the past, I think with good effect. Mm-hmm. But it seems almost like a prerequisite today, especially in a SaaS business, to do the kind of analysis that says, okay, this business is going to perform well because we really understand the propensity of these customers to be retainable. And then you also have the advantage of benchmarking, or so to say, baselining against a potential result 6 months down the road. You go back and say, well, how did we do? Are customers coming out of this integration process feeling positive, or have we really lost them?
Yeah. As we said before, the SaaS business, has intrinsic metrics and benchmarks. You mentioned, the net retention number. That's the gold standard. Above 120%, you're approaching the gold standard. If you're at 130, 140%, I mean, you are, you're Midas level. So that's the great thing about SaaS companies, because, the metrics themselves really express, where customers are. And then, then it's a matter of, does the acquisition screw it up?
Yeah.
And, and the acquisition can screw it up because the acquiring company will want to, put their processes in place and, and look for places for synergy to save money, deduplicate, et cetera. And that can, be not a death knell, but that can, set an acquired company back.
Well, and you talked about, different cultures and the challenge of getting organizations to move. And now you're talking about two cultures that are different by definition because they didn't spring from the same original ground. And so that's always going to be an interesting challenge. I wonder whether you'd agree with this. So I think of the software industry to some extent, experience in the 1990s as being the evolution of packaged on-prem software. And I don't think the industry as a whole, and again, this might be a gross simplification, cared too much about customers. At that point, I used to describe software sales as bank robbery because you would take the money and you'd run. I mean, at the end of the quarter, your best performing sales rep was the guy who closed a deal 5 minutes to midnight before the end of the quarter. You'd recognize the revenue, and then the customer's locked in. You got a 20% annuity stream on maintenance, but the customer had paid up front and capitalized this expense. Very, very hard for them to go anywhere. And it's very hard to imagine a company saying, delighted customers are our focus, when, as you said, on-prem, you may not even know what they're doing with your product. SaaS, I think, changed the game in ways people didn't anticipate, because all of a sudden, your future revenue stream from a customer vastly exceeded your current revenue stream. So you're financially incented to care.
Yeah.
I think as SaaS matured, we started to care about NRR. We started to care about customers. Are we maturing with that, though, or are we still at the early stage of that opportunity? Because it still feels to me like we're in the earliest innings of really understanding the potential of growth through the customer, even in SaaS businesses.
Yeah, no, I think we're early, I'm not sure we've crossed the chasm yet, in the, still to this day, software, companies call their customers users, The only other business where the customer is a user is in the drug business, as far as I know.
Maybe it's no accident. Maybe that's no coincidence.
No, it's not a it's not a coincidence. And really, it's SaaS it really promotes the whole idea of thinking of customers as subscribers, where you just like being a subscriber to something online or a physical magazine or whatever. Every transaction either promotes another one or demotes a next one, and I'm not sure that we've quite crossed that Rubicon yet, and some of it is we're still looking at tools that tell us how customers are using our software. I mean, I'm an OG, so I grew up in the school of software where you did it. You did software because it was magic, and you could go out and sell dreams, and then go back to the lab and make those dreams come true, and keep moving the dream out. And it was very customer centric, going back to the 80s and early 90s. I think that once the industry, hit its, inflection point, I think that's when, we flipped over from being very product led to very sales and marketing led and financially led.
Right.
I think now SaaS is actually the great equalizer across all of those things, because you have to get all of them right.
Right. I think that's right. You have to be product led. You clearly need to be financially savvy and figure it out, but also you need to be customer led. And depending on the marketplace and the competitiveness, that's going to vary a bit. You could argue with the general state of technology, coming off a 20-year run of cheap capital and moving into potentially a 10 or 15-year period of more expensive capital, efficiency and growth through the customer is a pretty logical strategy, which I think brings us full circle back to what you started with, which was engineered NPS. How do we, and clearly we have a thesis on how you do it, and we think you should change the way you measure and build these predictive data sets and much better data. But at the end of the day, building these engineered NPS models where you can figure out what's wrong in your business, you can tweak it with a high confidence you're going to create outcomes, is the potential to be much more efficient with capital, much more efficient with operations, and get growth through mechanisms that aren't really financial engineering or just throwing money at it.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like that's a pretty big opportunity for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, totally agree. I think, NPS science will get you a certain distance, but honestly, and the reason you and I have, built a relationship is because the way you're looking at CX and making it actionable by, really inspecting and correlating operational data is, I think you're working on the holy grail of CX, actually.
Thank you for that. That seems like a really good point to pause our conversation. I did enjoy especially the user piece. I'm sure lots of people have heard that before. That actually hadn't occurred to me, despite being in the industry for 20 odd 30 years. I'm also reminded that somebody once told me the only time they pronounce you anything is either dead on arrival or man and wife. So I think this.
I love that.
So on that note, Mark, thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Could talk about this all day.
Yes, for sure. And I hope this won't be the last chat we have.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.